The Seattle skyline glittered flawlessly through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse, a testament to a man who had meticulously rebuilt his life from nothing. Yet on the sleek mahogany desk, disrupting the immaculate order, lay a single crumpled lease agreement signed by a woman he had sworn to erase from his memory 5 years ago. He hadn't just walked away from their marriage. He had vanished into thin air, leaving her to the ruin of her own betrayal. But now the cruel irony of fate had placed the deed to her fragile sanctuary right into his hands. If stories of hidden scars, unspoken sins, and the dangerous lines between revenge and lingering grief draw you in, stay with me. There are still many locked doors in this city waiting to be opened, so if you want to see what happens when the past comes, collecting, don't leave the channel just yet. The rain in Seattle didn't fall. It hung in the air like a cold, damp mist, blurring the sharp edges of the city. From the 42nd floor of the Mitchell Holdings Tower, Blake Mitchell stood with his hands deep in the pockets of his tailored charcoal suit, watching the headlights of cars bleed into streaks of red and white on the freeway below. The glass was cool against his forehead. It grounded him. It reminded him that he was here untouchable, elevated far above the messy, unpredictable pulse of human error. The final transition documents for the Westlake complex are ready for your signature, Blake. The voice of Tim Nelson, his property manager, and the closest thing he had to a friend, broke the silence of the cavernous office. Tim walked in, setting a thick manila folder on the expansive mahogany desk. "Any red flags?" Blake asked, his voice a low, even baritone that rarely betrayed emotion. He didn't turn away from the window immediately. "Standard mess," Tim sighed, tapping the folder. "It's a Class C building. Deferred maintenance, a leaking roof, and a tenant roster full of people who are one bad week away from missing rent. I've flagged 3 units for potential eviction if they don't clear their arrears by the first of the month." Blake finally turned. He moved to the desk, the soft amber glow of the desk lamp catching the subtle silver at his temples, a physical souvenir of a past life. 5 years ago, Blake had been a different man. A man who smiled easily, who rushed home early on Fridays, who believed in the absolute sanctity of the vows he had taken. Then came the night he came home early to the scent of another man's cologne in his bedroom. The muffled sounds, the sight of Robert Brown's jacket draped carelessly over the dining chair. Blake hadn't yelled. He hadn't thrown a single punch. He had simply packed a single duffel bag, walked out the door, and erased his own existence. He pulled the heavy leather chair out and sat down, opening the folder. "Let's see who we're dealing with," he murmured, flipping through the pages of lease agreements, background checks, and late payment notices. Unit 102, Unit 214, Unit 308. His finger traced the lines of text. He absorbed the data mechanically. Names, occupations, credit scores. Then the world stopped spinning. The hum of the HVAC unit faded into a static ring in his ears. The air in the meticulously climate-controlled room suddenly felt too thin to breathe. Blake stared at the paper, his thumb pressing down so hard on the edge of the page that the thick parchment began to crinkle. Unit 412, Tenant Valentina Cruz, Employer Speedy Delivery, Arrears $450. He read the name again and again. Valentina. The syllables tasted like ash on his tongue. He stared at the signature at the bottom of the lease, the same elegant looping V that used to sign his birthday cards, the same hand that had rested against Robert Brown's chest. "Something wrong, Blake." Tim's voice seemed to come from underwater. Blake closed his eyes for a fraction of a second, locking the ghost of her perfume back into the steel vault of his mind. He forced his heart rate to steady, drawing a slow, calculated breath. The irony was almost suffocating. He had crossed states, changed his career, and buried his identity just to ensure he would never have to look at her face again. And yet, here she was. Not as a ghost, but as a data point in his spreadsheet. A woman working a blue-collar courier job, struggling to pay rent in a decaying building that he now owned. "No," Blake said quietly, his eyes hardening into something resembling polished obsidian as he stared at her name. "Nothing is wrong, Tim. Just an unexpected acquisition." He closed the folder, the loud thwack of the cardboard echoing in the quiet room. He had vanished to escape her betrayal, but now he was her landlord, and the quiet sleeping beast of resentment inside his chest had just opened its eyes. The relentless Seattle downpour drummed against the windshield of the battered Speedy delivery van, a chaotic rhythm that perfectly matched the dull ache behind Valentina Cruz's temples. She wiped the condensation from the inside of the glass with a frayed sleeve, her breath blooming in the frigid air of the cabin. The heater had died 3 weeks ago, but she hadn't reported it to dispatch. Complaining meant drawing attention, and drawing attention meant risking the overtime shifts she desperately needed to survive. She shifted the transmission into park outside a towering glass condominium in South Lake Union, the neon reflections bleeding across the wet, slick asphalt. Grabbing the digital scanner and a heavy tape-sealed box from the passenger seat, she braced herself before stepping out into the deluge. The cold rain bit into her skin instantly, soaking right through the thin corporate blue windbreaker. 5 years ago, she would have lived in a building exactly like this one. She would have been curled up on a plush sectional sofa, the ambient heat wrapping around her, a glass of expensive Pinot Noir in hand, while she waited for her husband to come home from the firm. Blake. The name still echoed in the hollow spaces of her chest, an unhealed, jagged fracture that ached fiercely whenever the weather turned bitter. She buzzed the intercom, keeping her head down as the night concierge eyed her dripping uniform with a familiar mixture of mild pity and practiced disdain. Leaving the package on the pristine marble counter, she hurried back out to the van, the squelch of her soaked sneakers embarrassingly loud in the sterile, quiet lobby. Once safely back behind the wheel, Valentina leaned her head against the worn fabric of the headrest and closed her eyes for a fleeting second. The physical exhaustion of moving boxes for 10 hours was grueling, but it was the mental weight that truly suffocated her. She thought of Robert Brown, the intoxicating, catastrophic mistake that had cost her everything she held dear. The affair hadn't been born of profound love. It had been a desperate, selfish, and ugly rebellion against the quiet, steadfast stability Blake had offered her. And when the walls finally caved in, when Blake simply vanished into the ether without a word, a scream, or a signature on a divorce paper, Robert had vanished, too terrified of the social stigma and the financial ruin he had helped create. She didn't blame either of them for leaving. The wreckage of her life was entirely her own architecture. Her phone buzzed in the cup holder, the harsh light illuminating the dim, damp cabin. It wasn't a text from a friend, she had none left. It was an automated calendar reminder, rent due, $450 short. A heavy knot tightened in her stomach. That morning before her shift, she had found a crisp white envelope taped to the peeling pane of her door at the Westlake complex. The letterhead was intimidatingly minimalist, Mitchell Holdings. The previous lenient landlord had quietly sold the building, and the new corporate management was aggressively auditing the tenant accounts. Valentina had traced the embossed logo with a trembling finger, terrified of what a zero-tolerance corporate policy would mean for her. She was already working double shifts, eating canned soup and selling off the very last pieces of jewelry she hadn't pawned. If they evicted her, she had nowhere left to fall. She put the van in gear, the engine whining in protest as she merged back into the slow-moving red-lit traffic on Interstate 5. The windshield wipers dragged back and forth, clearing the water only for a second before the glass blurred again. She stared blankly at the taillights ahead, completely unaware that the invisible hands tightening the noose around her fragile life belonged to the very man she saw every time she closed her eyes. Valentina exhaled a shaky breath into the cold air, gripping the steering wheel until her knuckles turned white. She just had to survive the week. That was the only promise she could afford to make herself anymore. The fluorescent lights on the fourth floor of the Westlake complex flickered with a low, agonizing hum, casting a sickly yellow pallor over the peeling floral wallpaper. Blake Mitchell hated the smell of the place, a suffocating, stagnant blend of damp, drywall, stale cigarettes, and old cooking oil. It was the undeniable scent of defeat. He stood at the far end of the narrow corridor, a bespoke navy cashmere overcoat draped immaculately over his broad shoulders, looking entirely alien against the backdrop of urban decay. Tim stood beside him, tapping a silver pen against his leather clipboard. The water damage in Unit 410 is extensive. We'll need to gut the drywall to check for black mold. And then there's 412, Tim paused, glancing down at his notes. Right, the late rent. Blake didn't respond. He had insisted on this personal site visit under the guise of an acquisition audit, but deep down he recognized the dark, masochistic curiosity that had dragged him from his pristine glass penthouse down into this purgatory. He needed to see it. He needed to witness the physical reality of the consequences she was living through. Then the heavy metal door of the stairwell groaned open. The sound of dragging, exhausted footsteps echoed against the cheap, scuffed linoleum. Valentina emerged from the stairwell, her head bowed, damp strands of dark hair clinging to her pale cheeks. She was still wearing the oversized blue windbreaker of speedy delivery, clutching a plastic bag from a discount bodega in one hand and fumbling blindly with a ring of keys in the other. She looked so incredibly small. The vibrant, luminous woman who used to command attention at his firm's dinner parties in silk slip dresses was entirely gone, replaced by a hollowed-out shadow carrying the weight of the world on her slumping shoulders. Her numb, freezing fingers slipped. The keys clattered loudly onto the floor, the metallic noise sharp and violent, like a gunshot in the quiet hallway. With a heavy, trembling sigh, Valentina crouched down to retrieve them. As she stood back up, her exhausted gaze inadvertently drifted down the corridor toward the two men standing near her door. First, she saw the custom-made Italian leather Oxfords, then the sharp, uncompromising cut of the tailored trousers. Finally, her eyes traveled up to the face. The plastic grocery bag slipped from her grasp, hitting the floor with a dull, wet thud. A single can of cheap soup rolled out, stopping gently against the rotting baseboard. Time abruptly ceased to exist. Across 30 feet of flickering, grim hallway, Blake and Valentina locked eyes. For 5 years he had been a phantom, a ghost she begged for forgiveness in her sleep and dreaded in her waking hours. Now he was here, materialized in the flesh, a towering figure of authority, blocking the path to her fragile sanctuary. Blake felt the breath instantly vanish from his lungs. The fortress of ice he had spent half a decade building cracked for a fraction of a second, threatening to expose the raw, bleeding wound beneath his ribs. He watched the exact moment the realization hit her, the sudden widening of her dark, sleep-deprived eyes, the violent tremble of her lower lip, the way all the blood violently drained from her face, leaving her ashen and paralyzed with terror. She parted her lips, perhaps to whisper his name, perhaps to offer a futile apology, but her throat constricted. No sound came out. The air between them grew suffocatingly thick, heavy with 1,000 unspoken screams, with the lingering ghost of Robert Brown, and with the deafening silence of the night. Blake had disappeared. "Blake?" Tim asked it, frowning as he noticed the sudden, palpable drop in the temperature of the room. "Do you know her?" Blake's jaw tightened so hard it ached. He forced the microscopic crack in his armor to seal shut, locking the agonizing grief away and replacing it with something infinitely colder, something terrifyingly blank. He looked at the woman who had broken him, noting the sheer panic in her eyes and the desperate poverty of her existence. He felt no triumphant vindication. He felt only a heavy, crushing emptiness. "No," Blake said, his voice a smooth, flat blade that effortlessly cut through the stagnant air. He held her shattered gaze for one final devastating second. "She's just a tenant." Without another word, he turned and walked toward the elevator, his precise footsteps echoing down the hall, leaving Valentina frozen under the flickering light, completely destroyed all over again. The deadbolt of Unit 412 slid into place with a hollow metallic clack. Valentina leaned her entire body weight against the cheap, chipped wood of the door, her knees finally buckling. She slid down to the worn carpet, burying her face in her freezing, trembling hands. Her lungs burned as she tried to pull oxygen into her chest, but the air felt impossibly thin. "She's just a tenant." Blake's voice, devoid of any warmth, any anger, or any recognition, played on a torturous loop in her mind. He hadn't screamed. He hadn't demanded answers. He had looked right through her, erasing her existence with 3 simple words. The absolute coldness of his eyes had been infinitely more devastating than any physical blow. She sat on the floor for what felt like hours, listening to the relentless Seattle rain lashing against her single-pane window. Slowly, the biting cold of her damp uniform forced her to move. She peeled off the speedy delivery windbreaker and dragged herself toward the tiny kitchenette to boil water for the dented can of soup she had salvaged from the hallway. Then a sudden erratic knocking rattled her front door. Valentina froze. The kettle in her hand hovered above the rusted stove grate. It wasn't the sharp, authoritative knock of a property manager. It was desperate, frantic. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she crept toward the peephole. The distorted glass warped the figure standing in the dim corridor, but the broad shoulders and the nervous shifting of weight were unmistakably familiar. A wave of profound, paralyzing nausea washed over her. She opened the door just a fraction, keeping the security chain engaged. "Val," the man whispered, his voice cracking, "please open the door." Robert Brown stood in the flickering fluorescent light. 5 years ago, Robert had been the embodiment of reckless charm, a junior executive with an easy smile, expensive cologne, and a dangerous ability to make Valentina feel seen when her marriage had fallen into a quiet, predictable routine. Now the man in the hallway was entirely unrecognizable. His once handsome face was haggard, lined with exhaustion, and the unmistakable gray pallor of prolonged desperation. His clothes hung loosely on a thinning frame, and the sour scent of stale whiskey and unwashed fabric seeped through the crack in the door. "Robert," Valentina breathed the name tasting like poison. "What are you doing here? You can't be here." "I have nowhere else to go, Val," he pleaded, pressing his palm flat against the door, trying to push it open against the taut metal chain. "I lost the sublet. They locked me out this morning." "Just the couch, Val. Give me 2 nights to figure things out." "No," she said, her voice trembling, but finding a desperate edge of resolve. She looked at his desperate eyes and felt absolutely nothing but a crushing, suffocating wave of self-hatred. This was it. This pathetic, broken man was the prize she had traded her beautiful, stable life for. This was the catastrophic mistake that had shattered Blake. "Don't do this," Robert sneered, the desperate facade slipping to reveal a bitter, ugly resentment. "Don't act like you're better than me. We're in this together, remember? We blew our lives up together. You owe me." "I don't owe you anything," Valentina hissed, terrified the thin walls would broadcast their argument to the entire floor. "When the money dried up, you walked away. You left me to drown. Leave Robert, now." "Come on, Val," he slurred slightly, wedging the toe of his scuffed boot into the narrow gap between the door and the frame so she couldn't close it. "Just let me in. Don't be a bitch about this. It's freezing out there." "Take your foot out of the door," she demanded, her voice rising in panic as she pushed against the heavy wood, unable to dislodge him. The illusion of their past passionate romance was dead, stripped bare in the dingy hallway, leaving only the ugly, humiliating reality of their shared ruin. He pushed harder against the door, his eyes darkening with a desperate, unpredictable anger. Valentina braced her feet against the floorboards, terrified of what would happen if the fragile metal chain snapped, completely unaware of the silent figure stepping out from the shadows of the stairwell just down the hall. The metal security chain groaned, its cheap screws pulling agonizingly against the rotting wood of the doorframe. Valentina shoved her shoulder against the heavy door, her boots slipping on the worn carpet, as Robert leaned his weight from the outside. The smell of stale whiskey and wet wool filtered through the narrow gap, suffocating her. "Just let go, Val." Robert rasped, his voice dropping to a desperate, ugly hiss. "Don't make a scene. Remove your foot from the door." The voice cut through the stagnant air of the hallway. It was not a shout. It was barely above a conversational volume, yet it possessed a dark gravitational pull that made the oxygen in the corridor freeze instantly. Robert froze. He blinked slowly, turning his head toward the shadows near the stairwell. Valentina stopped breathing entirely. Through the narrow crack of the door, she saw him. Blake Mitchell stood 10 feet away, perfectly illuminated by the flickering fluorescent light overhead. He had sent Tim away. He was alone. His hands were casually tucked into the pockets of his charcoal trousers, his posture impeccably straight, completely unbothered by the grime of the Westlake complex. Robert squinted, his alcohol-dulled brain struggling to process the immaculate figure standing before him. And then the blood drained from his haggard face. The recognition hit him like a physical blow. "Blake," Robert whispered, taking a clumsy step back. The toe of his scuffed boot finally slid out of the doorway. Valentina immediately slammed the door shut, but she couldn't bring herself to lock it. She stood paralyzed, her forehead pressed against the cold wood, listening intently to the nightmare unfolding on the other side. Blake didn't move. He didn't clench his fists. He simply observed the trembling, ruined man who had once destroyed his life. He looked at Robert's stained collar, the desperate panic in his bloodshot eyes, and the pathetic slump of his shoulders. 5 years ago, Blake had wanted to murder this man. Now, looking at the miserable wreckage before him, Blake felt nothing but a profound, chilling disgust. "You are trespassing," Blake said, his tone as sharp and smooth as freshly cut glass. I was just visiting," Robert stammered, his bravado entirely evaporating. He looked wildly around the empty hall, instinctively raising his hands in a defensive gesture. "Look, man, I didn't know you were here. I don't want any trouble." "You are trespassing on Mitchell Holdings property," Blake corrected him, his eyes never leaving Robert's face. He pulled a sleek black smartphone from his coat pocket. "You have exactly 30 seconds to walk down those stairs before I have the police escort you out for aggressive vagrancy and attempted breaking and entering." "Property," Robert echoed, his voice cracking. He looked from Blake to the peeling number 412 on Valentina's door, the horrific realization sinking in. "You own this place." 20 seconds, Blake replied, his thumb hovering over the screen. The humiliation was absolute. Robert Brown, the man who had confidently dismantled a marriage with a charming smile, was now being discarded like common trash, entirely powerless against the quiet, terrifying authority Blake wielded. Without another word, Robert turned and practically ran toward the stairwell, his heavy footsteps echoing frantically down the concrete steps until the heavy metal door slammed shut, leaving a ringing silence in his wake. In the hallway, Blake slowly put his phone away. He stepped up to Unit 412. He knew she was standing right on the other side. He could hear the faint, erratic sound of her breathing through the thin wood. He didn't knock. He merely leaned slightly toward the door. "The structural integrity of that door frame is compromised," Blake stated, his voice devoid of any shared history, any lingering grief, or any triumph. It was purely transactional. "Any further damage to company property will be added to your outstanding balance. Your rent is due on the first, Ms. Cruz. We do not grant extensions." Valentina clamped a hand over her mouth, biting down on her own knuckles to muffle the fractured sob tearing at her throat. She listened to the slow, measured sound of his leather Oxfords walking away, leaving her utterly alone in the dark, trapped in a prison he now possessed the keys to. The dawn sky over Seattle was the color of bruised iron. Inside the penthouse office of Mitchell Holdings, the air was perfectly still, smelling faintly of expensive espresso and leather. Blake sat at his desk, staring at a single sheet of paper resting perfectly parallel to the edge of his blotter. It was a standard legal form, the kind Mitchell Holdings issued dozens of times a month across their various properties. 3-day notice to pay rent or quit. The blank space designated for the tenant's name was filled in with crisp black typography, Valentina Cruz. The outstanding balance was a mere $450, an amount Blake casually dropped on business lunches without a second thought. Yet in the grim reality of the Westlake complex, it was a guillotine hanging over a desperate woman's neck. He picked up his Mont Blanc pen, the heavy resin cool against his fingers. He didn't have to do this. He could have instructed the accounting department to write off the arrears as a transitional loss. But the dark, unhealed fragment of his soul demanded to know the truth. For 5 years, he had wondered if she ever truly mourned the man she had shattered, or if she only mourned the comfortable life she had lost. He needed to push her. He needed to see if the pressure would crack her facade and reveal a woman capable of genuine accountability, or if she was still the same selfish creature who had invited Robert Brown into their bed. Blake pressed the gold nib to the paper and signed his name with sharp, precise strokes. It was not just a legal document, it was a psychological tripwire. Across the city in the damp, freezing confines of Unit 412, Valentina was awake long before her alarm. Her muscles screamed in protest as she pulled on her still damp, speedy delivery uniform. The radiator hissed feebly, offering more noise than heat. She walked toward the kitchenette to pour a cup of instant coffee, but her worn sneakers stopped dead in the narrow entryway. A stark white envelope lay on the faded carpet, slipped under the door gap during the early hours of the morning. Valentina's breath hitched. She knelt down, her cold fingers trembling as she picked it up. The Mitchell Holdings logo was embossed in the top left corner, a silent, elegant symbol of absolute authority. She tore the flap open, her eyes scanning the heavy cardstock. The bold, capitalized letters swam into focus. It was an eviction warning. 72 hours to clear the balance, or the locks would be changed and her meager belongings seized. But it wasn't the legal jargon that made her heart drop into her stomach. It was the signature at the bottom. It wasn't signed by a faceless property manager or an automated stamp. It was signed in dark blue ink by Blake Mitchell himself. Valentina slowly sank onto the edge of her unmade mattress, the paper rattling softly in her shaking hands. The message was deafeningly clear. He was not going to look the other way. He was not going to let her quietly exist in the margins of his new empire. He was systematically closing the walls in around her, stripping away the illusion that she could outrun the consequences of her betrayal. She stared at the sharp angles of his signature, remembering the times she had watched him sign holiday cards and mortgage papers in a life that felt like it belonged to someone else entirely. The crushing weight of her reality settled over her shoulders. She had no money, no safety net, and absolutely nowhere to hide. If she wanted to survive, she could no longer cower behind a locked door. Valentina folded the notice and slipped it into her pocket, a heavy, sinking resignation taking root in her chest. She had to walk into his world. She had to face the man she had destroyed, not in the shadows of a broken-down hallway, but under the harsh, unforgiving lights of his own territory. The elevator doors parted with a soft, expensive chime, depositing Valentina onto the 42nd floor of Mitchell Holdings. The air up here was entirely different from the damp, exhaust-choked streets below. It was thin, heavily filtered, and smelled faintly of cedarwood and untouchable wealth. She pulled her faded, rain-dampened coat tighter around her shivering frame, acutely aware of the muddy water seeping from her worn boots onto the immaculate white marble floor. The receptionist had looked at her with thinly veiled disdain, but after a brief hushed phone call, she was directed to the heavy oak doors at the end of the corridor. Valentina pushed the door open. The office was vast, encased in floor-to-ceiling glass that framed the gray, weeping Seattle skyline. Sitting behind a massive desk of polished slate was Blake. He didn't look up immediately. He continued writing the scratch of his fountain pen, the only sound in the cavernous room. She walked forward, her legs feeling like lead, and placed the crumpled three-day notice onto the pristine surface of his desk. "I don't have the money," Valentina said. Her voice, though barely above a whisper, shattered the heavy silence of the room. Blake slowly capped his pen. He leaned back in his leather chair, steepling his fingers as he looked at her. His gaze was analytical, dissecting her exhausted posture, the dark circles under her eyes, and the slight tremor in her hands. "Then the legal parameters of the document are quite clear, Ms. Cruz," Blake replied smoothly. "You have until Friday to vacate the unit. Mitchell Holdings will retain your security deposit to cover the arrears." "Stop." She choked out the single word, tearing painfully from her throat. The dam she had built to survive the last 5 years suddenly cracked. "Please, Blake, just for 1 minute, stop talking to me like I'm a spreadsheet." Blake's jaw tightened imperceptibly. "We have nothing else to discuss." "I have nowhere to go." Valentina's voice fractured, a desperate raw sound that echoed off the cold glass walls. Tears finally spilled over her lashes, tracing hot, stinging paths down her pale cheeks. "I know what I did. I wake up every single day suffocating on the guilt of it. I destroyed the best thing I ever had, and I am paying for it in blood. But you have to understand, before Robert, before any of the ugly, unforgivable things happened, I was already drowning." Blake remained motionless, a statue carved from ice, but his knuckles grew white where his hands were clasped together. "You were gone, Blake." She wept, the agonizing truth of their final year together spilling out into the sterile room. "You worked 80-hour weeks. I ate dinner alone in that massive, beautiful house every night. I slept in an empty bed. I didn't sleep with him because I stopped loving you. I did it because I was entirely invisible in my own life, and I was so deeply, profoundly terrified of the silence." She stood there, stripping bare, offering the bleeding, broken pieces of her rationale, not as an excuse, but as a desperate plea to be understood. Blake stared at her. For a fleeting second, the ghost of the man who had loved her surfaced. He remembered the missed anniversaries, the canceled vacations, the times he had chosen a client over his wife. But then right behind that memory came the visceral, sickening image of Robert's jacket draped over their dining chair. The empathy instantly turned to ash. "Loneliness is a tragedy, Valentina," Blake said, his voice dropping to a low, devastating whisper that offered absolutely zero warmth. "Betrayal is a choice. You made yours." He picked up a fresh file from his desk, dismissing her entirely. "Close the door on your way out. You have until Friday." The heavy oak doors clicked shut, sealing Blake back inside his temperature-controlled fortress, but the faint, lingering scent of damp wool and cold rain refused to dissipate. It hung in the air, a ghost, refusing to be exorcised. Blake remained frozen in his leather chair for a long time, staring at the empty space where Valentina had just stood. The silence of the office, which had always been his sanctuary, suddenly felt incredibly loud. He reached for the crystal decanter on the edge of his desk, pouring 2 fingers of amber scotch. As he lifted the heavy glass, his knuckles brushed the mahogany surface, and he noticed a microscopic, undeniable tremor in his fingers. She was shaking so hard she could barely press the elevator button. Blake didn't flinch. He took a slow, deliberate swallow of the scotch as Tim Nelson stepped out from the shadows of the adjoining conference room. Tim walked over to the desk, his usual easygoing demeanor replaced by a sharp, uncompromising gravity. It was a standard tenant dispute, Tim, Blake said, his voice dropping into its familiar, flat baritone. He turned his chair toward the floor-to-ceiling windows, refusing to meet his friend's gaze. Nothing you need to concern yourself with. Don't insult my intelligence, Blake, Tim replied quietly, taking a seat opposite the desk. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. I pulled the file on Unit 412 after the walkthrough at Westlake. Valentina Cruz. I recognized the name from the old corporate background checks when we set up your LLCs 5 years ago. I know who she is. Blake's jaw tightened. He kept his eyes fixed on the dizzying grid of Seattle traffic far below. Then you know why the eviction stands. I know that when I met you 5 years ago, you were a hollowed-out shell of a human being who worked until he passed out just to avoid dreaming. Tim said, his voice entirely devoid of judgment, carrying only the heavy weight of a loyal friend. You built Mitchell Holdings to escape that life, to escape her. And you did it. You won Blake. She broke a contract, Blake countered coldly. She missed rent. I am acting exactly as I would with any other delinquent account. Bullshit, Tim fired back, the words slicing through the quiet room. You didn't delegate this to the accounting department. You personally signed a 3-day notice for a measly $400 and forced her to come up here and beg. You are not managing a property, Blake. You are twisting the knife. Blake finally turned, his eyes flashing with a sudden dark volatility. She destroyed my life. She brought another man into my home. Do you have any idea what it costs to just walk away from that? To swallow the humiliation and disappear? I do, Tim said softly, holding Blake's furious gaze without retreating an inch. I watched you pay that cost, but look at your hands, man. Blake glanced down. His grip on the crystal glass was so white-knuckled, it threatened to shatter the thick base. You think you have the upper hand because you own her building? Tim continued, standing up and buttoning his suit jacket. But you're bleeding just as much as she is. You dragged her back into your life to punish her, but all you've done is lock yourself inside the exact same cage. If you push her onto the street, it won't erase what she did. It will only destroy whatever piece you have left. Tim walked toward the door, pausing with his hand on the brass handle. Let the accounting team handle the Westlake arrears, Tim advised, his tone softening to a quiet plea. Let her go, Blake, before you tear your own stitches out. The door clicked shut, leaving Blake entirely alone with the echoing silence and the sudden terrifying realization that his grand revenge felt exactly like drowning. The dispatch radio on Valentina's dashboard cracked with a burst of static, slicing through the quiet exhaustion of her 14th hour on the clock. It was a priority one-rush delivery, a sealed legal dossier that required a direct in-person signature from a senior partner attending a private function at the Beacon. Valentina gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles aching. The Beacon was a gilded fortress suspended above the city, a rooftop lounge where the city's elite brokered deals over $50 cocktails. It was exactly the kind of place she and Blake used to frequent on Friday nights, back when her name carried weight and her wardrobe consisted of tailored silk rather than cheap, water-resistant polyester. Parking the battered speedy delivery van in the loading dock, she took the service elevator up to the penthouse level. The mirrored walls of the cave offered a cruel, inescapable reflection. Her dark hair was pulled back into a messy, damp knot. Her skin was sallow stripped of all its former radiance, and the oversized blue windbreaker hung off her thinning frame like a borrowed shroud. She looked exactly like what she was, a ghost haunting the edges of a world she had been exiled from. The elevator door slid open with a soft ping, instantly drowning her in a wave of ambient jazz and the low, sophisticated murmur of wealth. Valentina stepped onto the plush, dark carpet. The Beacon was bathed in warm amber light, surrounded by floor-to-ceiling glass that offered a sweeping panoramic view of the glittering Seattle skyline. Waiters in crisp white jackets floated through the crowd carrying trays of champagne flutes. The air smelled of expensive oud, roasted cedar, and old money. She kept her head down, clutching the thick manila envelope to her chest like a shield. She navigated the perimeter of the room, acutely aware of the side eyes and the subtle physical shifting of bespoke suits and designer dresses as she passed. She was a jarring, ugly smudge on a flawless canvas. She spotted her recipient near the main bar, a silver-haired lawyer laughing loudly. Valentina approached, her voice barely audible over the music, as she requested his signature on her digital scanner. He signed it without looking at her, entirely dismissive, waving her away before returning to his conversation. Task completed, she turned to retreat to the service elevator, desperate to disappear back into the cold, forgiving dark of the city. Then, the crowd parted. Standing in the center of the room, holding a low-ball glass and commanding the absolute attention of half a dozen executives, was Blake Mitchell. He wore a midnight blue tuxedo jacket that fit him with devastating perfection. He looked powerful, untouchable, and entirely at ease. This was his kingdom. Valentina froze, her breath hitched, trapping the oxygen in her lungs. As if sensing the sudden shift in the room's atmospheric pressure, Blake turned his head. Across the sea of crystal glasses, glittering diamonds, and calculated smiles, his eyes locked onto the faded blue of her speedy delivery uniform. The low hum of the party vanished from Blake's ears. For a fraction of a second, the mask of the ruthless corporate titan slipped. He looked at the woman standing near the bar, the woman who had broken his heart, the woman he had just threatened with eviction, and the sheer staggering brutality of the contrast hit him like a physical blow. He was surrounded by opulence, drinking rare scotch, while the woman he had once sworn to protect looked like she was slowly starving to death in the shadows of his success. Valentina didn't look away this time. She let him see it. She let him see her exhaustion, her poverty, and her absolute humiliation. She stood there completely stripped of her dignity under the warm amber lights, silently acknowledging the vast, unbridgeable ocean that now separated them. Then with a slow, agonizing turn, she walked back toward the service elevator, leaving Blake standing in a room full of people, suddenly feeling entirely suffocated by his own triumph. The heavy soundproof door to the service corridor swung shut instantly, severing the ambient jazz and the clinking of crystal glasses. The stark transition was jarring. Here the lighting was a harsh utilitarian fluorescent, and the air smelled heavily of industrial cleaner and damp concrete. Valentina pressed the down button for the freight elevator, her trembling fingers leaving a faint smudge of rainwater on the brushed steel panel. She leaned her forehead against the cool metal door, closing her eyes. She just needed to hold herself together for 3 more minutes. 3 minutes until she could disappear into the belly of the city, crawl into her freezing delivery van, and finally shatter where no one could see her. The slow, methodical click of expensive leather against concrete echoed down the narrow hall. Valentina didn't need to turn around. She knew the cadence of his footsteps as intimately as she knew her own heartbeat. The oxygen in the narrow corridor seemed to evaporate, replaced by the faint, intoxicating scent of oud and bergamot that she had spent 5 years trying to wash from her memory. Blake stopped 3 feet behind her. He had abandoned a room full of Seattle's most influential power brokers, walked away from his own kingdom, just to follow a ghost into a dimly lit service hallway. "The freight elevator is slow," Valentina whispered, her voice fractured and exhausted. She didn't turn to face him. She couldn't bear to look at the immaculate midnight blue tuxedo while wearing her waterlogged corporate uniform. "I'll be gone in a minute, Blake. I didn't know you would be here." Blake stared at the rigid, defensive line of her shoulders. He looked at the frayed collar of the speedy delivery windbreaker, the damp hair plastered to the nape of her neck, and the slight involuntary shiver racking her fragile frame. For half a decade, he had used his anger as a furnace, burning the memory of her betrayal to forge an untouchable empire. He had orchestrated the eviction notice. He had coldly cornered her in his penthouse office. He had wanted her to bleed. But standing here in the quiet, sterile silence of the hallway, the furnace abruptly went out. There was no triumph coursing through his veins. There was no righteous vindication in seeing the woman he had once vowed to protect reduced to a trembling, impoverished shell. Instead, a crushing, suffocating weight settled over his chest. The revenge was entirely hollow. It tasted like ash. "I bought the Westlake building because I saw your name on the internal audit." Blake confessed, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that barely disturbed the quiet air. It was the first honest thing he had said to her in 5 years. "I signed the eviction notice myself. I wanted to corner you. I wanted to see the consequences finally crush you." Valentina slowly turned around. The harsh overhead light caught the hollows of her cheeks and the profound, agonizing sorrow pooling in her dark eyes. There was no anger in her expression, no defense left to mount. She was completely, utterly surrendered. I am already crushed, Blake, she said softly, a single tear slipping free and tracing a pale line down her face. I have been dead since the night you walked out of that house. You don't need to push me over the edge. I am already in the abyss. Blake's jaw clenched. His hand twitched at his side, an old buried instinct urging him to reach out to wipe the tear from her cheek, to pull her into his chest and shield her from the cold. The realization hit him with terrifying clarity. He didn't hate her. He was just drowning in the grief of losing her, and he had been using cruelty as a life raft. The freight elevator arrived with a harsh metallic clank, the heavy doors groaning open to reveal a scuffed, empty steel box. Valentina stepped inside the physical distance between them, suddenly feeling like a chasm that could never be crossed. She turned to face him one last time as the doors began to slide shut. Blake stood perfectly still in his tailored suit, a king locked in a prison of his own making, realizing too late that punishing her would never heal the wound she had left behind. The relentless Seattle rain had finally stopped, leaving behind a heavy, suffocating silence in Unit 412. Valentina sat at the tiny, wobbly kitchen table, her shoulders slumped beneath the weight of the dark, freezing hours of the early morning. She was still wearing the damp trousers of her speedy delivery uniform. The encounter at the beacon played on an agonizing, fragmented loop in her mind. She hadn't just seen anger in Blake's eyes as the freight elevator doors closed. She had seen the raw, unhealed, bleeding grief of a man entirely trapped in his own purgatory. It wasn't triumph she had witnessed in that dim service hallway. It was the terrifying realization that his pursuit of vengeance was drowning him just as quickly as it was crushing her. For 5 years, Valentina had accepted her brutal punishment because she fundamentally believed she deserved it. She had let the guilt strip away her dignity, her comfort, and her voice settling into this life of poverty as a form of penance. But seeing Blake, the man who used to be so full of quiet warmth, steady grace, and profound decency, twisted into a cold, vindictive ghost of himself, broke something irrevocable inside her bone. Her betrayal had destroyed their marriage, but his obsession with punishing her was going to destroy his soul. She could not let him become a monster just to make her pay. Valentina reached for a crinkled sheet of lined paper from a cheap spiral-bound notebook. She found a plastic ballpoint pen and stared at the blank page. The 3-day notice to pay rent or quit, bearing his sharp, unforgiving signature, still sat on the counter, a stark white rectangle in the gloom of the apartment. She didn't write an apology. There were no words left in the English language that could bridge the catastrophic chasm between them. Instead, she wrote the only thing that could set them both free. To Mitchell Holdings, I am writing to formally submit my notice to vacate Unit 412 effective immediately. I will surrender the keys and leave the premises by dawn. You may retain the entirety of the security deposit to cover the outstanding balance. She signed it with the same elegant looping V that had once signed his anniversary cards, though this time her hand was remarkably steady. The decision brought a strange, hollow clarity to the freezing room. She had no savings, no destination, and no safety net. She would buy a one-way bus ticket out of Seattle and disappear into the sprawling, unforgiving anonymity of the Midwest. She would do for him exactly what he had done for her. 5 years ago, she would vanish. Valentina stood up and began to pack. It took less than 10 minutes. A single faded duffel bag held the entirety of her ruined life. A few worn sweaters, a pair of heavy boots, and a small, tarnished silver locket she had hidden at the very bottom of a drawer. It was the only piece of her past she hadn't pawned, holding a tiny faded photograph of Blake from a summer they had spent in Carmel, back when they were still oblivious to the tragedy they would become. Carrying the folded piece of notebook paper, she walked out into the flickering yellow-lit hallway of the 4th floor. The air was stale, smelling of damp drywall and old regrets. She walked down the concrete stairs to the ground floor and slipped the notice under the door of the on-site management office. As the paper disappeared beneath the cheap wood, Valentina exhaled a long, shuddering breath into the cold air. The suffocating cycle of toxicity was finally broken. She had lost absolutely everything, but in this final, silent act of surrender, she was giving Blake the only gift she had left to offer his freedom from her ghost. The pale, anemic light of a Seattle dawn crept across the mahogany desk in Blake's office, illuminating the dust motes suspended in the quiet air. The handwritten note lay in the center of his leather blotter. The blue ink on the cheap torn notebook paper was a stark, jarring contrast to the surrounding corporate opulence. Tim had found it slipped under the Westlake management office door and brought it straight up. Blake stared at the elegant looping V at the bottom of the page. She was leaving. The realization did not bring the intoxicating rush of victory he had anticipated for 5 years. Instead, it brought a profound, heavy stillness. The war he had been fighting inside his own chest abruptly ended. 40 minutes later, Blake's sleek black town car idled at the curb outside the Westlake complex. The relentless rain had finally ceased, leaving the city washed in a cold gray clarity. He bypassed the slow elevator, taking the concrete stairs up to the fourth floor. The corridor was quiet, the fluorescent lights buzzing with their familiar, sickly hum. The door to Unit 412 was open, just a crack. Blake pushed it gently. The rusted hinges offered a muted groan. The apartment was entirely stripped of life. The thin blankets were folded precisely at the foot of the sagging mattress. The tiny kitchenette was bare. Standing near the counter, her worn duffel bag slung over one shoulder, was Valentina. She was placing two brass keys side by side on the chipped laminate surface. She froze at the sound of the door. Slowly, she turned to face him. There was no panic in her eyes today. The terror that had paralyzed her during their first encounter and the defensive desperation she had worn at the beacon were completely gone. In their place was a quiet, devastating resignation. She had surrendered the very last piece of ground she held. Blake stood in the doorway, the bespoke wool of his overcoat brushing against the rotting wood of the frame. He looked at the woman who had once been the center of his universe. He saw the dark circles under her eyes, the sharp angle of her collarbone beneath the faded Speedy Delivery jacket, and the heavy weight of a guilt she would carry for the rest of her natural life. He realized then with absolute clarity that he couldn't punish her any more than she was already punishing herself. If he stopped her now, if he forced her to stay under his thumb just to watch her bleed, they would both burn in the same hell forever. He had to let the ghost go. Blake didn't speak. There were no words left between them that wouldn't sound like a weapon. Instead, he took a slow, deliberate step back into the hallway, clearing the threshold. He left the path to the stairwell entirely open. Valentina looked at the empty space he had yielded. Her breath hitched a soft, fractured sound in the quiet room. She understood the magnitude of the gesture. It was not forgiveness. Some betrayals were simply too deep to be washed away, but it was absolution from his revenge. It was a release. She picked up her bag. Walking toward the door, she paused just a fraction of an inch from him. For a fleeting second, the faint familiar scent of bergamot and old rain suspended between them, a silent eulogy for a beautiful life that had burned to the ground. She offered a single microscopic nod. Blake held her gaze, his dark eyes stripped of their icy armor, reflecting only a solemn shared sorrow. He nodded back. Valentina stepped out into the hallway and walked toward the stairs. She didn't look back. The sound of her boots faded into the concrete stairwell, swallowed by the waking hum of the city. Blake stepped fully into the empty apartment. He walked over to the counter and picked up the two brass keys. The metal was still faintly warm from her touch. He closed his fist around them, feeling the sharp edges press into his palm. The past could not be undone, but as he stood alone in the quiet, empty room, Blake finally exhaled. The agonizing chapter was closed.